Studies Association, and we are focusing on Latino studies in the classroom, critical issues in pedagogy. We want to thank you all for joining us as we engage in questions related to pedagogical practices in the classroom. How do we critically engage our students so that knowledge is embraced as an alternative life experience and not just as academic capital? And this is part of the new neoliberal reality of most universities today. How do we model critical pedagogy in the classroom and we kind of pay homage and celebrate the original values of the student movements in the 60s and the 70s that allowed us to create these kinds of critical pedagogies in the classroom? What are the most difficult challenges we face teaching Latinx studies? And today, given the war in Gaza, given the censorship of Latino studies and race studies in red states like Florida, I think these are all important questions for us to think about today. And how do we validate the need for providing our students historical facts and specific content while also creating new paradigms for embodied learning and decolonial knowledge? So let me introduce our presenters. We originally had invited Raul Coronado, but unfortunately he had a death in his family, and he's flying right now on his way to Texas for the memorial services and the funerals, so he had to cancel at the last minute. Our other presenters are Marisol Negrón, Assistant Professor of American Studies and Latino Studies at University of Massachusetts, Boston, where she's also affiliated with Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and with the Critical Ethnic and Community Studies Masters in Science program, of which she is a co-founder and core faculty. This year, Marisol is a visiting scholar at the Women's Studies Research Center, Brandeis University, and her forthcoming book in fall 2024 is entitled Made in New Rico, Fania Records, Latin Music, and Salsa's New Rican Meanings, which will be published by Duke University Press. So felicidades, Marisol. She also is engaging now in working on issues after Hurricane Maria, and she has a forthcoming article entitled Puerto Rican Climate Migration After Hurricane Maria, Implications for Public Mental Health, co-author with Rosalyn Negrón, Lorena Estrada Martinez, and Marisol herself. And finally, she also works as a consultant for the Boston Public Schools in terms of K-12 Latino Studies syllabi. Our next presenter is John Ribó. He's assistant professor at Florida State University, and he specializes on Caribbean and U.S. Latinx literatures and popular cultures. His scholarly project focuses on how images of Haiti and the Haitian Revolution in Caribbean and U.S. Latinx artists, musicians, and writers function to critique historical injustices and racial inequalities. And he will also be able to share his own experiences teaching in Florida under Ron DeSantis. And Elizabeth Velázquez, last but not least, she's an assistant professor in the Latino Studies Department at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She's a cultural anthropologist whose research interests focus on state violence in El Salvador, grassroots peacemaking, transnational feminisms and activism, and the politics of intersectional equality and justice. And at one point, I was talking to Gilbert Rosas, your chair, and asking him, who's a great dynamic professor in your department, and your name was the one that came up right away. So I welcome you to our webinar. So again, the format will be each presenter will talk for about 15 minutes or so, 20 minutes, and then they will engage with each other in terms of comments, questions, and follow-ups. And then we will start considering questions from the audience. If you have a question, you can send it through the Q&A button. And Julie Minnick, who is hosting the webinar, will moderate the question and answer session at the end. I want to also thank not only Julie and the English department at UT Austin for hosting the Zoom webinar, but also Monica Gosen, our secretary, who I know is here, for all the communications, the advertising, and the support for Latino Studies Association. And to our colleagues in the Executive Council of LSA, Josie Saldaña, Rafael Perez Torres, and Lee Bebu for their leadership and participation. We have been very busy with the conference planning, and so this is a little break from all that kind of routine and work. And we look forward to the dialogue and the conversation. I'm sure it's going to be inspiring and educational for all of us. So let's begin then with Marisol. thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much. I want to first thank Francis for the invitation to participate in the LSA webinar, and also to Julie for helping making it happen and helping us get organized for the webinar today. Let's see here. And there we go. And what I would like to do today is to, oh, there we go. And if it looks like I'm not looking at you, it's because I have another screen with my notes and I can't get it all on the same screen. So to jump right in, really what how I'm approaching the conversation today is to provide, from my perspective, how I would answer these questions that Frances posed at the beginning of the webinar, how I would answer those questions today in this particular historical moment. Because as I thought about the different questions, I realized that, of course, when I started teaching in graduate school and taught my first seminar, I would have answered these questions very differently. Likewise, when I started my postdoc and then my current position, again, I would have answered them differently. And so for me, this is an opportunity to think about the current historical moment and in relationship to where I'm currently teaching and where I'm currently based. And so I am teaching at UMass Boston, here in Boston, where I also live. And UMass Boston is a, quote, majority minority institution. Most 50% of the students are first generation college students. About 40% of students are immigrant students. And many of our students work outside of school, some of them up to 20 to 40 hours a week, in addition to taking a part-time or full-time load. And many of the students in my classes, and I teach in American Studies, Latino Studies, and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, my courses are often cross-listed across these departments, are oftentimes, right, Latinx students, first, second, third generation students. Whether the students are Latinx or not, many of them are multilingual. English may be their first, second, or third language, in fact. And so for me, how I teach Latinx studies is very much informed by where I am, who are the students who I am teaching, and what are their interests and their needs. And also to always situate Latinx studies in relationship, right, to ethnic studies and to other ethnic studies programs. And for me, that is very key to engage students critically and very much to situate for students, right, this big overarching concept of Latinx studies, but to then do a place-based ethnic studies pedagogy. And what I'm sharing with you now is a slide, in fact, from a professional development seminar that I did for K-12 teachers in Boston public schools, called Boston Through a Wider Lens. I did it as part of several presentations that were sponsored by the Black, Latinx, Native American, and Asian American research centers at UMass Boston. And so that what we work on together is this idea of place-based ethnic studies. And so that really is the way that I approach also teaching at the college level, whether that is looking at the institutions that are in the community. For example, here you see images from Villa Victoria, which is a historically Puerto Rican neighborhood in the city that is much more multi-ethnic and multiracial now, but which is grounded in Puerto Rican activism during the late 1960s and early 1970s. And so that we see that part of place-based ethnic studies, right, is to bring a particular kind of specificity when we talk about Latinx studies in the classroom and are teaching it, so that it is a continuous relationship between Latinx studies as a field and the broader issues, and the ways in which Latino studies is a community-based and responds to our communities, and then looking at those questions within the local for students as a way to critically engage them and to connect for them the significance of Latinx studies and the ways that we bring together what is happening in their homes and in their communities and bring that into the classroom to then for them to experience that reciprocal relationship between the two. That includes, in addition to looking at particular neighborhoods, for example, and of course, this is just one way, one of the ways that these can be done is by looking at particular neighborhoods, community figures, some who have passed away, others who are continuing, are leaders in the community, whether it be here, we see Felita Oyola, who was involved in the arts, Jose Maso, who is a radio legend in Boston and holds a lot of the city's Latinx musical history, right? Or looking at the small businesses, right? The civil infrastructure, if you will, of Latinx communities in Boston. And what were the historical places, for example, with regards to salsa music, where performers went, where tickets were sold, right? What are the different record stores, the different performance spaces, etc. And what we see here is that part of engaging students critically also entails, in many instances, right, the need to work with ephemera, the need to think about how do we recuperate histories in communities that are not documented. And certainly during the Q&A, I'm also very happy to talk about how do we do this if we're teaching in areas without large or significant Latinx communities, because there is a way to, I would argue, to engage in these kinds of practices regardless of where we're teaching. And then that in doing this and making a place-based ethnic studies, what we can also do then, right, is in terms of meeting students where they're at, one of the ways to do that is through their love of music. And we know that for Latinx communities in the United States, music continues to be a privileged space for the constitution of identity. And so looking at those themes around music and Latinidad, for example, and then situating them within the history of Boston is one of the ways that students then also become very excited, because the music that they're listening to, right, is also the music that we're listening to in class, whether it's the history of Boston in one of the as a point, a nodal point in reggaeton, for example, both in its circulation on the radio, right, with Looney Tunes, for example, who lived in they were in Lawrence, they were working in the Harvard cafeteria, for example, right? It allows students to start thinking about these issues in ways that are very particular to them. The same thing, for example, here you see, right, the documentary, the cover for the documentary of Luis Valga, the Bachata Story, and then connecting it to the Dominican community in Boston, historical migration patterns, politics, etc., and cultural expression within the community. And then finally, with regards to engaging students, one of the ways that I propose is involving students in creating a living archive. And in doing so, we're also modeling, right, the ways that not only is embodied knowledge being privileged, but that students in recuperating this knowledge and recuperating the history are themselves producers of knowledge. And it may be that they are also then seeing how to insert themselves, right, and see themselves and their families and their family histories as part of broader historical, social, and cultural movements. And so, and we're also teaching them and talking about creating living archives, right? What happens when the communities to which we belong do not have, right, the established archives, or they are more recent? And so that part of what we do then is modeling and building with them alternative archives. But most importantly, it is not to simply add, right? It is not an additive endeavor, but rather one to help students think about how does what we learn now transform what we thought we knew. And not only in regards to the histories of the United States, but to the histories of our own communities, for example. And so in that regard, it is incredibly important that we ourselves model in both the kinds of materials we bring into the classroom, the kinds of projects in which students engage, that we're modeling the kind of critical pedagogy wherein Latino studies is not something that is static, right? But something that is always in process, something that is always being reconstructed, that is always being reimagined. And in that regard, right, one of the challenges in Latino studies is precisely that, right? That we need to continuously help students understand that knowledge is something that is always in the process of being produced. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple minutes. And then, of course, we're in a historical moment when ethnic studies are under attack. And so that there are challenges both within the classroom, but also from outside of our communities that are impinging on our own abilities in some cases, right? As I'm sure we're going to hear in a little while, to do what we do. So that one of what I would like to just, talk about briefly here is inside the classroom. What are the challenges in terms of working, in my case, in classrooms that are majority Latinx students, specifically Puerto Rican, Dominican, Central American, mostly Salvador and Guatemala, and then also some increasing numbers of Mexican descended students. And what I find that one of the challenges, and I think this is in any classroom, is in teaching students critical analysis, to dislodge the assumptions that they come into the classroom with about Latinidad. And when we're talking about Latinx students in particular, for example, but certainly not exclusively, right, having them think about and deconstruct this idea of Latin America, right, this idea of what is Latino, particularly with regards to questions of language, religion, race, and geography. Dislodging the assumptions by showing how the concept of Latin America even is a social construct, helping them come to their own understanding of, who's included in Latin America and who is not. Not everyone, Spanish is not something that unites us, right? Even thinking, for example, at UMass Boston, there are many Haitian students who define themselves in relation to Latinidad and as Latinx. And so that has made for really interesting conversations in the classroom around the construction of what is, quote, Latin America, and what is, quote, Latino, Latina, Latine, Latinx, etc. The most challenging thing I found last spring when in one of my courses has been where I arranged a course on Latinas in the United States around Latinidad and Blackness, was the resistance of students to explore their own ethno-racial identity in relation to anti-Black racism in our communities. And how do we, in the classroom, centering Black female epistemologies within the classroom. What I found most challenging was the desire of non-Black, mostly Latinas, the challenge of really exploring one's own racism, one's own internalized racism and anti-Black biases. And that returning to the idea of how do we critically engage and model how we teach, and I'm happy to talk more about this, is the question of vulnerability within the classroom as a professor, and not only for students, and to situate myself as someone who is willing to learn, right, for my students. And I think about that particularly in this historical moment, right, with the bombing, the ongoing bombing of Gaza. And how do we teach during this particular historical moment a process of communal learning, right, where we are all learning together. And particularly when there are so many, the connections to Latinidad and to Latinx communities are front and center right now. And so this is a particular moment when we can bring both the historical into the classroom, right, in terms of why the question of Palestine and its colonial reality resonates so much within Latino communities, as well as to talk about Latinx communities or Latinx individuals who are Jewish, right? Latinx individuals who are also Muslim or who are also Arab. And so that it's an opportunity for us to have very complex, very difficult discussions in the classroom, but where we need to think about how we do that. And connecting it back, right, to the founding of Latinx studies, whether it's Puerto Rican studies, Chicano studies, etc., right? And so that we can, for example, talk about Palestine in a way that is historically grounded, not only in relation to Israel and Palestine, but also in relation to Latinx communities, and in particular, right, the Young Lords, the movement for freedom by the Young Lords was always internationalist and always local. And so this is from a 1970 newsletter when the Young Lords were advocating for freedom in Palestine. And we can certainly see this with regards to Latinx communities. Now, these pictures were taken at the March in Washington on November 4th, so this past weekend, and we see signs in Spanish, we see signs, folks from talking about it from a Salvadoran perspective, for example. And here, this is I'll leave us with this slide, and I've lost track of time, so if I have time, if someone could tell me, that would be great. I'd love to just play this very short video from the march in Washington, D.C., where the chants that we hear are the ones with relations to the Philippines, to Mexico, and Puerto Rico.
Go ahead, Marisol, 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay, perfect.
We can't hear the audio.
Okay, I don't know. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll share what's happening. So obviously we have the Filipino communities have the banners out in front, and what we hear being chanted 3 times each is from Palestine to the Philippines, stop the US war machine. From Palestine to Mexico, border walls have to go. From Palestine to Puerto Rico, occupation is illegal. And so I'll end by saying that this is, in this particular moment, we have an opportunity, right, as I talk about place-based ethnic studies, to see the ways that place-based ethnic studies is complementary, right, to having these broader micro discussions and complex and specific to time and to place discussions about imperialism, colonialism, race, and the bombing of Palestine. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank Marisol for her excellent presentation, and I'm also looking forward to Elizabeth's presentation shortly. I also wanted to thank Francis, Monica, and Julie for all the work done to put on this event, and for inviting me to share. My presentation is a little bit different. I don't think I'm going to have quite as much to say. I am coming from North Florida, Tallahassee, and thinking about what it's like to teach Latinx studies at a time when they're drafting resolutions at the university that make it illegal to teach subject matter that could make students uncomfortable or that could be seen as political advocacy. I'm thinking about this at the same time that they're drafting Board of Governors resolutions that ban the use of any university funding for any events, speakers, parties, anything having to do with anything that could be associated with diversity, equity, or inclusion. And for me, this actually dovetails quite nicely with how I had designed my Latinx literature class. I teach an undergraduate Latinx Intro to Latinx Literature class, and then I teach it as a graduate course in which we talk about pedagogy and we add more theory, and the students can come to my undergraduate class and teach and get experience teaching Latinx literature. But I started developing this class when I was in graduate school, and I developed it around the laws that were being passed in Arizona in 2010, 2011, the banning of Mexican American studies there, the libro traficantes bringing books in that were banned. And so I like to start the class by reading about and watching the documentary Precious Knowledge to think about why Mexican American Studies, La Raza program in Tucson was banned in 2010, 2011, and how that is a type of censorship and political intervention in the educational sphere that repeats throughout the U.S. history, and why have so many of these books that are canonical in Latinx literature and African American literature, queer literature, et cetera. Why have they been banned over and over and over again? Why are they being banned today? I didn't quite bargain, in the early to mid 2010s. I didn't quite bargain for this class design to be so relevant, since originally coming up with the class and thinking about what were some of the issues that we could see repeating either into the future or into the past around censorship and banning of ethnic studies, of queer studies, of women's studies, gender and sexuality studies. I didn't know that I would have the experience of seeing somebody like Jorge Garcia Peña being denied tenure, other people at Ivy League schools being denied tenure. These things have been folded into the class, and we're discussing them. And now we're discussing what's going on in Florida. It's quite a surreal experience to be teaching a class that begins with this case study of banning Mexican American studies in Tucson. And why was it banned? What were the issues? What were the reasonings for and against? How did people react? How did this help spread Latinx studies throughout much of the Southwest? As we know, other ethnic studies programs rose as this ban was defeated in Arizona, and the teachers in Arizona were spreading their message further. So dealing with this complex dynamic in which the banning of something, the censorship of something, actually brings light and attention to it, and thinking about that critically, thinking about the sort of cultural cachet that brings for authors, despite all the horrible realities that also entails. All of these things have become quite real in my classroom, and the students are so far responding admirably, I would say. They, I think, are energized by the idea that not only now in 2023 or in 2010, but really since the colonial encounter in the 16th century, knowledge in the Americas has been a struggle for power, for agency, for expressing particular views of collectivities that are then articulated to the state. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. I can give you all more updates in the Q&A about how things are going in Florida. It's not been good. The faculty union is under attack. We have to get to 60% membership of all the faculty to keep our union. They, as I mentioned, they already have the Board of Governors resolution that's coming down the pipeline that's going to potentially be banning all DEI events and content. We also have the end of tenure effectively with post-tenure review. After tenure, faculty will be required to submit 5-year review packets. And then we have the takeover of New College in South Florida, where slowly but surely they've replaced the leadership. They're asking for $500 million to reshape New College as a ultra conservative religious liberal arts college. That's underway. There's indications that many of the small campuses throughout the Florida public system will be seeing these kinds of transformations if the DeSantis agenda continues to succeed. So these are some of the realities that we've been dealing with here, and I think a lot of what Marisol has brought to the table in terms of thinking about the histories of place-based Latinx studies, ethnic studies in Florida could be great tools if only they're allowed to remain legal. I know that when our faculty union reached out to faculty to ask about, sorry, I got an email from Marianne Roy-Leitner. Oh, she's saying to give me a big hug. Thank you so much, Marianne. I was hoping there wasn't an audio visual problem. What was I at? I was saying that when our faculty union polled our faculty, over 2/3 of our faculty are on the job market. So we're seeing a large exodus, myself included, from Florida. And I think that that's by design. That is, when we've talked to leadership, they sort of shrug and they say, well, if you don't want to be here, there's a job market. You can go out there and find another job. We've also had issues of, a lot of our faculty of color are assistant professors or just newly minted tenured professors. And a lot of us were recruited specifically to teach the kind of content that's being banned. And so while people are trying to cover the story and get the word out, last year, I know that me and most of my colleagues at Florida State were being asked to participate in news stories for NPR and other national news outlets. And so I think that in addition to the questions of pedagogy, there's also questions of professional formations. How do we as an organization, how do we as professors, how do we as colleagues stand up for one another? I do not think ultimately that these kinds of maneuvers are going to win out, because as my class shows, even when you try your best to destroy the knowledges of people systematically through some of the largest militaries and religious organizations, et cetera, there's a way that resistance continues, and people persist, people persevere despite these attempts to shut us down. And I would say for our students here in Florida, they're not buying the narrative about ethnic studies, about queer studies, about women's studies, about gender studies. They're appalled and they think this is ridiculous. They're scared of their degrees not being meaningful in the future because of the way that this undermines these institutions. So those are some of my thoughts on this topic, and I can talk more about the specific things I do in my class. One way I like to do some of the things that Marisol was saying was I have a final project that I do that's open-ended. They can really do whatever they want as long as they can make an argument for why it's relevant to our readings. So I've had students who've done videos based on their families' migrations to the United States. I've had students who've done poetry. I've had students who've made art. I've had students who've written beautiful critical essays. And because part of what I'm trying to teach them through this question of censorship and power in relation to knowledge and Latinx studies and ethnic studies more broadly, I always want them to think about what's not included in our syllabus, what's necessarily left out. Where has Latinx studies, literary studies sort of come from? Where's it going? Who are the learners, right? So have excellent contributions from students, and really they've taken up this idea that, as Marisol was saying, ephemeral spaces or spaces of public performance or spaces of community that aren't always or
Monica, I didn't need to participate in this exciting conversation with Marisol and John to talk about Latinx studies in the classrooms. So, when I think about Latino studies, teaching and critical pedagogies, I think about the kind of teaching that made a difference in my own academic journey, in my education as a Central American mestiza woman who migrated as a young adult to the United States. And so one critical approach for me has been bringing the connections between the histories of violence that have forced so many Central Americans to migrate to the United States, and how those experiences of violence shape the family, the social, the political dynamics within the Latino communities here in the United States, but also how those experiences have shaped forms of solidarity. So I like to talk about like these waves of migration because they are affecting us and shaping the dynamics, the way that we relate with one another in different ways. So for instance, in the 1990s, a lot of the Central American migration took place because of the civil war that were happening in Guatemala, in El Salvador, and also like it had like a very strong link to the ways that the United States government was funding those wars. And so a lot of the people who migrated during the late 1970s, 1980s, they had been engaged in social movements, they had been engaged in activism, and they were coming to the United States as a seeking political asylum. So when I teach, the way that I like to bring that history into class is like, I have a class that is about gender, Latino migration. And so I talk about this documentary that is called Made in LA, that discusses how like undocumented and documented women come together to demand economic justice in the garment industry. And so one of the beautiful things that this documentary does is how these women are bringing their own knowledges, their own experiences that they had in very difficult situations in context of war in El Salvador or in Guatemala, but also like people that have left Mexico for economic reasons, like how they come together, and based on those knowledges, they were demanding the garment industry here for a better paid. And so once I show this film and talk about those histories of violence, those histories of struggles and forms of solidarity, I usually like to ask students about like, what do you think, what are some of the knowledges that you can think about that your parents have brought with them to the United States? How those knowledges have helped them or your relatives navigate social relations, family relations here in the United States, and what they have found, what they as children, first 1.5, second generation of children who have migrated in the United States, what they find useful about those knowledges. And so those are ways that I always see my students, like, because a lot of the time we know that there were difficult situations that forced many of us to migrate to the United States. And so, but when you make those connections, I see in our students, like, the lights go on and it's like, oh, you know, like, I know that my father left because of the war, but I didn't know that these forms of silences or these ways of communicating very suavecito, like, it's a way that comes from this context of war. So, but this connecting it to, now I want to move to another example. A more contemporary example, after the civil wars, what we have had in Central America has been a context of neoliberal economic violences, and how the neoliberal economic model has brought up issues like neocolonial forms of extractivism. And what is happening now is that these forms of extractivism are taking place largely in indigenous communities in Guatemala and indigenous communities in Honduras with the Lencas or the Garífonas. And so what we're seeing in the last few years has been a huge migration from Afro-Latinos, indigenous Latinos that come to the United States. And so this is speaking to what Marisol was saying. These migrations are really making us to rethink, like, Latinidad and what are other histories of violences that, because of the previous context of the Cold War, we were not talking about it. But one of the things that we are seeing that is emerging is about the racial formation in Central America and how that has shaped also the state formation, and how that state formation has been a mestizo state formation that has silences indigenous and Black communities. And so having these new waves of migrations in the United States is really raising questions about how that history, the colonial history and the state formation that happened in Central America and other Latin American countries have also, those logics have migrated to the Latino communities in the United States, where we find anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity. And so a lot of the times, to help those discussions, because what I find is it's very challenging, you know, we're trying to find a space when we are talking about racial dynamics in the United States for the way that we enter and our students enter that debate. And so what I find very useful text to talk with the students is Luis Urrieta's Critical Indigeneities, because they not only talk about, like, the migration, but it also talks about how indigenous communities bring different ontologies, different ways of seeing the world that are helping them to navigate the United States. And so with that, we can make comparisons about how our own parents, when we are mestizos and other indigenous communities, what are the knowledges that we bring, and how we can open up to a larger conversation about power dynamics along the lines of race, along the lines of gender, sexuality. And so one of the things that I also like to encourage students to think about is like, how are the knowledges that we are learning in the classroom can be useful in our personal lives. And so part of these things, because a lot of the time, like students tell me, you know, we learn these huge concepts and then we're excited and we go home and we try to tell our families about what we're learning. But like, it's kind of difficult to translate like theoretical knowledge outside of the classroom. So a lot of the pedagogies that I like to do, it's kind of like at the beginning of class, I start by bringing a prompt or just having a text, and I ask my students, okay, for 2-3 minutes, write about what has been your takeaway of the reading. And just this for me gives them a moment to pause, to slow down, to reflect on the learnings. And then what I like to do that is to bring that form of reflection into collaborative learning. And so I like to pair students after writing for themselves. I like to pair students in order to exchange their answers. And then I like to work in small groups. But what I find about this, for instance, very specifically, when we talk about racial relations within the Latino communities, students have an opportunity to tell from their own experience, from their own lived experiences with each other. But this allows the students to be able to express the point of view, to question stereotypes, to question the dominant narrative, at the same time that each one of the students is being a role model for each other. So in that way, like as a faculty, as a teacher, I'm being there as another learner and teacher in the classroom. And what I like to say to my students is that all of us have lived experiences that are important in the classrooms, that we can connect them to the readings. So one of the things that I'm doing these days is like really trying to incorporate readings by Latinx queer of color, by indigenous Latinx scholars. And it's very interesting because by the end of the class, a lot of the students are saying, oh my gosh, did we just read like all this literature by faculty of color, by Latinx faculty? And so seeing that, that moment is very, very, very valuable. It's a very important moment for me. And then, so I also like to, and I don't know if I can show this. Let me see if I can. So these are some of the texts that I like to show my students. And for instance, right now I'm teaching a class about methodologies. And a lot of the challenges that I find there is that, okay, my student is like, we have these lived experiences. We know that they are value, but we sometimes don't feel like they will be valued in the broader society. And so I like to talk to them about like this book, Dreamers, about how undocumented scholars are producing knowledge, because that's a way to be showing to them that we are contributing to the literature and that their stories matter and that their embodied knowledge matter. And so let me just stop for a second. Okay. So And one of the other things I think that in this moment that it's in this moment that I find I want to connect to Marisol in the sense that this moment that we are living, it's so important to talk how Latino Studies was founded and came out of the social movement struggles, and how important is not to be silent. It's okay to be afraid to talk about very difficult issues, but it is also important to find ways to be able to talk about the things that matter to us, because I don't think there should be shame about being afraid. But if we wanted to talk about how settler colonialism has shaped the struggles in Central America and are connected to the struggles of Palestine, it's okay to be afraid, but it's important not to stop there. It's important to find ways to tell the truth and to talk about it. I'm gonna stop here, and then I'm happy to answer more questions in the Q&A.
Thank you, John, Marisol, and Elizabeth for these wonderful presentations. As somebody who retired 5 years ago, I have to say that censorship and the banning of ethnic studies continues. It was repeated in the 1990s. The culture wars were some things that people of my generation experienced. And so I resonate with John's comments about the importance of continuing to study these moments of censorship. And I feel very inspired by the fact that the decolonial practices of Latino studies classrooms is still very much well and alive. And I want to thank all of you scholars and colleagues for the wonderful work you're doing with students. So should we open it up now to any comments or questions you have for each other as presenters, and then we can move on to the audience. And if you don't, we can always start with the audience then. It's up to you guys.
There is a question in the
Okay.
Q&A box from Shiv Desai that I think actually will really get the panel. Like, it would be great to hear the panelists kind of talk to each other about. So this question is, how do we engage in solidarity to help communities who are being targeted? Also, how do we support educators to take a stand so they don't get scared? That comment came in earlier, but I think it dovetails beautifully with the end of Elizabeth's presentation on, you know, not being ashamed of being afraid, but also working through the fear. So once again, how do we engage in solidarity to help communities who are being targeted? And how do we support educators to take a stand so they don't get scared?
I have been thinking a lot about this particular topic of how do we engage in solidarity? How do we support each other? And I would, you know, one of the things I've actually had a similar conversation a couple of weeks ago at a conference I attended where we got into, you know, we had roundtable discussions about this exact topic. And that some of the things that we thought about are, for example, is how do we think about supporting each other in relation to vulnerabilities? So that, for example, you know, those scholars that class is an issue that we don't often talk about, right? And how do folks who are economically vulnerable may not be able to engage in the kind of tactics that others with financial security can engage in, or who have tenure versus non-tenure track faculty, et cetera. And so that as we think about how do we support each other? One of the ways that we can support each other is by thinking about who can do what, because what is radical is very different depending on where you are. So that radical right now in Florida, for example, for one colleague of mine, is simply reaching out to faculty to meet, to organize. Just the simple act of them meeting to have these discussions for someone who also supports her mother, right, is a radical act. And so I think that for us to look at ourselves and each other with grace in this particular moment, as we think about the different ways for whom we can stand and who will stand for us, is really important. And that the other thing that I would say, being in Massachusetts, which is so often considered so liberal, is that we have to be very careful, because a lot of these measures are moving through a lot of our states, even those that are considered much more liberal or progressive. And so that while the states in which they have passed are fewer, there are currently bills or people trying to move certain bills through the state house here in Massachusetts, for example, that are similar to Florida, and others that, and this has been happening for several years, right? Trying to get race removed from through anything having to do with the state. And it's being promoted, by the way, by people of color. So that those would be the two things that I would say, is that we need to be very careful with what's happening in our own states and make sure to look there, and then to reach out to each other with grace and see how we can support each other, and to be mindful of our power and those of us who have privilege that others may not have.
Yeah, thank you for that, Marisol, because I think that thinking about the differential vulnerabilities, what are the privileges that each of one of us have, but also the vulnerabilities. And, you know, a lot of time we embody both of them, the privilege and the vulnerability. It's just depending the context and the space where we are at, that we need to be. I think that what I want to emphasize is that those two things, privilege and vulnerability, can coexist. And being able to speak up, it's important, but it is also important to be strategic about it, right? If you are on the tenure track, there might be things that you can do that at this point maybe is to host conversations about what is happening. Maybe there are other things that we can do as a tenure track faculty that doesn't take, we can take a strategic risk. That is what I'm trying to say, is that each of us have to be mindful about the vulnerabilities, but also don't be paralyzed by those vulnerabilities, because we still have privilege that would allow us to do things according to where we are at. Yes, and a lot of the time, I think it's just so important for me. I have found it important to just hold a space for our students, to listen into how they are processing all the events that are taking place, you know, with the various words, like when the Ukraine war happened, with the conflict that is happening in Israel and Palestine, like our students are also feeling that, and are also feeling like what is happening in the United States. We're living in the post-Roe era, which I never thought about it. We are seeing what is happening in Florida, and all of those events are compounding. And so I think that just holding a space for our students, a way to process that, is very important.
I could add a couple things. I would go back to some of the points that were made in our presentations, and I would argue that in holding that space for our students, and then showing them, as Francis was alluding to, the sort of repetition of these kinds of waves of epistemological and political policy violence that are enacted in the educational space, but in other policy spaces as well. I think that we can also give our students the insight that these are not new, these are not the last time or the first time these things have happened, and that, as Marisol was saying, whether or not you think you're safe because you're in a supposed liberal bubble somewhere elsewhere, these things tend to spread. So if we allow them to gain traction in one part of the country, that maybe, this is a point I made at a conference a while back, but I think when this news first started spreading about these bans and these policies, I was noticing that a lot of my colleagues were really uncomfortable talking about it. Like, we're at a conference, we're having fun, we're partying, let's not talk about this. And it's like, you think that just because you're in some place where you think that you're safe, that this isn't affecting us. And I think we all know, people like us who do research on diaspora, on transnational communities, on the way that these things spread across state lines, both national and federal, that we, as Marisol was saying, we need to take this seriously, that it's not just going to be an issue for Florida, Arkansas, Texas, other states that we would assume. I think that they're, I was looking at, to say Utah studying banning DEI, other places, right? So those are some of the things I think. And I think also maybe sometimes we need to decenter in those longer historical narratives, maybe decenter ourselves as academics, that maybe we're not the heroes of the story, that maybe the community leaders are the heroes of the stories, and that we can, as Elizabeth was saying, hold space for our students and other community members to take those leads.
And to jump off of that, John, I would add, right, that part of that needs to be radical about Latinx studies is relationships with communities, right? And whether we teach in institutions or live in places where there are large Latinx communities or not, right? We can talk about how to do that in different contexts, but that, part of the neoliberalization of ethnic studies is the separation of ethnic studies from local communities. It's the separation, right? And that it always needs to be done with reciprocity, right? That we need to be engaging with local communities and humble ourselves, as you were suggesting now, right? Humble ourselves to what is it that they want and what is it that they need, and in what ways do we engage, right? And the Young Lords, for example, provide a great example when they went, right, in the late 1960s and said to folks in East Harlem, what do you want? And the Young Lords had these grandiose ideas, right? And folks said, we need garbage picked up, right? This was the disinvestment in Black and Puerto Rican neighborhoods in New York in the late 1960s and in the early to mid 1970s. And that's what the Young Lords did, right? They did what the community wanted. The other part of that, and going back to what Elizabeth was saying, is that I'm sharing here an image that I thought of when you showed the text that you teach. And that is, right, that having students think intersectionally is critical. Having students think in ways that are complex. What happens when one is undocumented and queer and poor, for example, right? Because this is the ways that we start to make those connections to broader issues in the world. I'm looking at the question about, from Alex Mireles that says, how do we support educators and graduate students about speaking up about Palestine and other decolonial movements in a time of doxing and hostility? Let me stop this share. And part of, I see the classroom as one of the spaces in which we help students be brave, right? I'm not on a college campus right now. Well, I'm at Brandeis, but I'm not teaching. I'm a scholar at the Women's Studies Resource Center. And I find that I have friends and colleagues who are in a lot of pain right now. And so we need to, on the one hand, we need, those of us who need to be brave, right, in this particular moment. But on the other hand, we need to think about the impact on that doxing, for example, right? And this is where we really need to think about allyship, so that we know that people are already being fired. We know that people who can't be fired because it would be too clearly retaliation are going to get fired for something else, right? I'm thinking about a young Palestinian woman who graduated from Harvard and was brought into the firm she's going to be working for, and asked why did she sign the letter supporting Palestine, a letter that in fact she had nothing to do with, right? But she got doxxed anyway. And she knows she's going to lose her job, and it's a matter of time. And so, you know, we have to stand in this moment, and how we all do it again goes back to the contextual, right? But we need, and this is where unions come into play as well, and the strength of a union, so that public institutions with strong unions may have folks who are part at institutions with strong unions may have more options in terms of protection. So for example, UMass Boston, the union at UMass Boston put out a statement that expressed support, condemned violence, all the violence in Israel, that, you know, the attack on Israel and the attacks on Palestine. And in this particular moment, one might say they didn't use, you know, there was conversations, they didn't talk about genocide, they didn't talk about they didn't talk about colonialism and sovereignty. In this particular moment, for the union to have officially put out a statement supporting a ceasefire is in and of itself an important step, right? It's not nothing. It was incredibly important. And so that I think institutionally, right, that the union did that gives some cover to faculty. But it's not easy, because people, so here there are trucks riding around Harvard Square with the faces, names, phone numbers, and addresses of students who support Palestine.
So on this topic, just kind of the threats, there is one more question from Orlando Lara, and I'm going to read it quickly. But then also there are a lot of questions on other topics, so we might kind of move to other topics as well. I also do want to note that Rita Hernandez asked a question of the title and author of the book that has Chapter 4, Reconstructing Latinidad, and I think I can type that answer into the Q&A, or somebody can put it in the chat. So if you can send me that info, I will just go ahead and type it in. But Orlando Lara asks.
No, I can send it to Rita.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Given that so many of these bans are moving through state and local legislatures, how much do we need to move beyond the classroom and the university as a space for resistance? So we'll take that as like the last question on the topic of threats, and then we'll move into some of the areas, some of the other areas that people are asking about.
I would think that it's high time that we move beyond the space of just a classroom and the university for thinking about how do we articulate our work in a way that can counter some of these discourses. I think one of the things, I was talking with a political scientist friend of mine, and we were discussing the current political climate, and she was talking about just how the branding of certain issues around, we could think about this in terms of Israel and Palestine, we could think about this around in terms of the higher education in the United States, but how we allow sometimes for the terms of the debate to be set before we intervene. And so I think a lot of what's happening right now is, think tanks, right-wing think tanks have pegged a lot of the work that we do as a certain kind of menace. And I think that there does need to be public interventions in the media and in other fora to intervene and to counter those kinds of discourses that are propagating